So you want to sail around the world, or maybe you're not ready to cut the lines and sail across the Pacific yet, but you'd like to buy a boat that is capable of doing that sometime in the future. Or maybe you're like all of us and you want a shit hit the fan vehicle for when Mpox and COVID have a love child and everyone turns into zombies. Well, my friend, you are in luck because there are thousands of boats to choose from. But with technology lending itself to ever wider transoms, ever taller masts, and ever more division on the sailing forums, how does one claw up this learning curve to make this decision? Well, you start with the most important question of all. Hello, I'm James, and in today's video, we're going to talk about how sailboats are built and what differences there are in those that are built to be offshore, to be blue water cruisers. Then we'll get into how racing has literally changed the shape of sailboats as we know it, and we'll talk about some types of hull shapes that will make your crew miserable. And finally, we'll put it all together and we'll talk about what makes a boat wet, what makes a boat comfortable, how is that even measured? Stay tuned because I'm going to show you a really cool trick that I invented to compare two boats on your short list. You're going to want to see this part. For all you catamaran and trimaran lovers out there, part 2 of this series will discuss this subject as it applies to multi-hulls. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an ex-Navy submariner turned sailor, and counting my Navy time, I've been living on boats for 23 years, full time. And in the better part of the last quarter century, I've amassed over 85,000 miles on catamarans and monohulls as captain. I've been in life or death situations, I've dealt with catastrophic damage out to sea, and I've seen some of the farthest, hardest to reach places on this planet. And as most of you know, I've had the pleasure of documenting that on my YouTube channel, and you can watch the playlist starting here. I'm going through my credentials because I think it's crucial that you guys know where this advice is coming from. I've tried to be as objective as possible, but some of my experience and opinions are going to shine through with a lot of this advice. I'll try to make it as objective as possible without being too didactic. Before we start, if you like this content and would like to be notified when I put out more of it, please hit that subscribe button and turn on all notifications. And if at any time in this video you dig the content, please buy the like button a Dentimore TV dinner, and before you serve it to him, take out the dessert. Also, stay tuned to the end of the video because I'm going to be breaking down all of my favorite cruising boats by price. Let's get into the video. Okay, the most important question that you're going to ask yourself is, what am I going to do with the boat? The answer to this question is directly proportional to the boat you're going to purchase. There is no shame at wanting sundowners on anchor at 5 p.m. every day in a protected anchorage, and actually that's very good relationship advice. For the sake of this video, we're going to define offshore as over 3 days from land. At that point, weather routing becomes unreliable. I will warn you that this is my definition, this is not anybody else's definition. The Navy uses 200 miles, the Coast Guard uses 100 miles. And as you can probably guess, insurance companies take the more conservative approach and use 20 miles. So again, for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on fiberglass hulls because that's where the vast majority of the market is. And we're going to focus on boats built in the last 40 years. That'll take care of 90% of you. Now, this isn't saying that fiberglass is superior to aluminum or steel or wood. It's just that it's more prevalent. Let me just interject this. I think aluminum is a fantastic material for boat building. Everything is welded to the deck, so there's no penetrations, there's no leaking. If you drop a wrench and scratch the oxidization, you just let it oxidize again. The problem is it's really expensive. It's hard to get the aluminum out of the ground and then make it into a plate and then make it into a boat, and all the welds have to be perfect, and they get really hot in the tropics. So again, choose your boat based on what you want to do and where you want to go, not the other way around. Okay, rant over, back to fiberglass. So in the early days of boat building, what you'd have is a big mold, and 15 guys would get in there and lay out all the fiberglass and put down some polyester resin on top of it. And they would do that for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks. And when they built it up big enough, they'd pop it out of the mold and there's your boat. They'd build the rest of the boat around that hull. You can see this type of manufacturing in a lot of the boats that came out of the Taoxing yard in Tainan, Taiwan, such as Masons and Pandas and a Baba, and also other boats like Pearson and Oyster and many, many, many more have solid glass hulls like that. These days, we don't really see full glass hulls anymore. There's only a few manufacturing companies that make that because it's very time consuming and very expensive. Nowadays, most boat manufacturing companies build boats with a composite structure or cord hull with a technique called vacuum bagging. Vacuum bagging is a technique where the resin is forced into the glass and carbon by using a bag and a pump. The benefits being we can use exactly the amount of resin needed, making the structure lighter and keeping costs to a minimum. To fully understand composites, we would need an entire video dedicated just to that, which I may do in the future, but for now, I implore you to do your own research on the different types of composites, different types of core materials, and the strength and shear strength of those different materials. What I will show you is a few pictures. This is from a Fiberglass 42 from 2002, and it got T-boned by this catamaran. Now, my delivery buddy was able to patch this up and get to the next port so he could finish the delivery, but wow. And that would never happen on a fully glass boat. In 1989, a French sailor named Philippe Jontot started a race. 11 Frenchmen, 1 American, and 1 South African set off on a round-the-world non-stop solo race via the 3 capes, which are the Cape of Good Hope, or Bonne Espérance in French, the famous Cape Horn, and Cape Lewin in Australia. Unbeknownst to these first 13 men, this race would be deemed the most difficult solo race in the world, the Vendée Globe. The Vendée Globe is still in its infancy compared to the America's Cup, which is the oldest international competition still operating in any sport, with the first race won in 1851. Why am I mentioning these races, you ask? That's a good question, and this is where you need to pay attention. The reason I'm spending so much time talking about this is because the racing circuit directly impacts the consumer market. And you can see how it's shaped the sailboats as time has changed. The boats that enter these races are state of the art, the absolute latest in sailing innovation. These boats just got faster and sexier and wider until the penultimate being foiling, which the consumer market hasn't really been able to do anything with yet, but it's coming, I'm sure. It was discovered that if you widen the aft end of the boat, water now has a minimum of lateral displacement, so it doesn't have to move as far. This makes for less friction, a more stable platform, and a boat that can carry way more sail area. But the real selling point for the consumer market was the aft cabins. They opened up 30% more space back there so that you could have these huge aft cabins, or more often 2 guest cabins back there, and then the owner cabin in the front. Even the biggest names in blue water boating, Oyster, Fiberglass, Amel, their sales started to suffer too, and they had to change their boats to compete. Now, while this design change has been touted as the best thing to happen to sailing since the gimbal drink holder, behind the scenes, the designers and the delivery captains and the offshore sailors are standing here slack-jawed because what we ended up with was this boat that was super fast and super stable, super fun to sail downwind, but just absolutely atrocious upwind. Horrible pounding and significant weather helm are just a couple of the trade-offs that you have with this type of hull shape. So because of all of that buoyancy in the aft part of the boat, something had to be done to balance it. So that's why you get these plumb bows and that forefoot that's stretched really far and really flat in the front. It makes it so it's very fast. It's almost like the planing holes of the race boats. So changing the boat like this leads to a very shallow forefoot. And that's the entry into the wave. So that's why the boat pounds so bad. To give you an example, I'm going to show you the trick I promised you at the beginning of the video. I'm going to take these 2 images. This is a Oyster 485 and a Hansa 460. I'm going to reduce the opacity by 50% on one of the images, and then I'm going to superimpose them onto each other. And then I'll line up the bow and the stern. And this even works with boats that are bigger or smaller. You can just increase and line them up, and it works fantastically well. You can see how much every boat is going to sail differently. So take an old cruiser that has a very good comfort ratio, look how the bottom profile is, look how that forefoot is, and then compare that to a boat that you're looking at buying. and you'll see how badly it will pound when you go upwind. On our transatlantic delivery of a Bavaria 60, my girlfriend called the forward cabin the Habitación de Terror, which means the room of terror. And I'm laughing about it now, but it was horrible. She was absolutely right. Nobody would go up there. Okay, keeping with the hulls, let's talk about on the other spectrum, there are double-ended hulls. So these double-ended hulls are supposed to be wave breaking, and actually that's kind of been debunked. In the words of Bob Perry, I drew double-enders because my clients requested them, mostly for marketing purposes. I've never seen any magic in the canoe stern or the double-ender. In my opinion, you either love the aesthetic of the canoe stern or you don't. A couple of boats have done them very well. I very much like the Hans Christians. I very much like the Valiant 42. I think those two boats are beautiful. For me, the loss of space makes up for the aesthetically pleasing stern. And you have a little bit smaller cockpit. If you do get pooped, it's not going to weigh the boat down so much. But if you're an avid fisherman or spear fisherman or water person and you want to get in and out of the water a lot, having a transom that goes down to the water is very nice. On a canoe stern, you really can't do that. So the other type of stern is an overhanging stern, like a Choi Lee or a Mason, and that's there because in theory it's supposed to be picked up by the following wave and allow for the back end of the boat not to be pooped by waves. And I can tell you from our delivery of a Mason 63 that was a beautiful boat. It was the best sailing boat I've ever been on in big seas, big winds, and she handled herself really well. I'm not sure if it was because of the hull shape or if it was because of the weight or possibly both, but I loved that boat. All right, let's talk about keels. That's the subject that everybody loves. Keels, they come in a bunch of different forms. Should you have keel bolts? Should it be encapsulated? Should you have a long keel? So let me just quickly go over my thoughts on keels. So the full keel. The full keel will track better. It's stronger in a grounding. The keel is completely encapsulated, so you never have to worry about it like falling off or having a problem where it joins up to the hull or damaging the hull in any way if you accidentally beach the boat or something like that. You can careen that boat, no problem. Scrape it, careen it on the other side, scrape it, and be done with it, which a lot of people do. As far as the sailing characteristics of that hull, she'll track like a train, which means you can literally let go of the steering wheel and go down and make a sandwich and come back up, and she'll be within 5 degrees of where you left her. Problem is, that type of keel hinders upwind performance. So you're gonna lose 5 or 10 degrees, maybe even 15, because it's too much friction against the water. It's too much lateral movement of the water, and it keeps you from going as high as you could with a fin keel boat. That's just the physics. It's also very difficult to back up in those boats. They tend not to have any helm response when going in reverse. Maneuvering in tight quarters is a problem too. It's actually so bad that a lot of sailors swear off them, and I do too. I think a good fin keel with a stub is the way to go. So what is that? This is called a keel stub. It is made in the mold, and then the keel bolts right up to that. That's how the Oysters do it. That's how Fiberglass does it. That's how a lot of the blue water manufacturers make a fin keel, but make it really strong. The best thing, actually, is to have a fully encapsulated keel, like the way Kraken Yachts does it. So what Kraken Yachts does is they have half a mold and the other half of the mold, and they lay up the boat like that, and then they pour the lead for the keel in a different mold, and then when everything's ready to go together, they snap that lead inside the mold, put the two pieces of mold together, finish the job, and put them together, and you have a fully encapsulated keel that's a fin keel. The only problem with making a boat in two halves is I've seen two boats split. Actually split. The whole hull split open. One had to have a tanker divert and give them big rubber pieces and big strap wrenches, and they were way out to sea, and they saved the boat and they were able to get it in port and get it fixed. The other one was coastal sailing when it happened, and they were able to get that one fixed as well. So neither one of those two yachts sank, but that's just my experience, what I've seen. I doubt that they probably have that problem with Kraken Yachts. I'm just saying, when you build a boat in two halves, that is a potential problem. Whatever you do, if you're going to go cruising, get something that's strong. What you don't want is the bottom of the boat like this and the keel like this, and there's nothing else there, like the Beneteaus and the Genots and the plethora of boats that are like that. They're just bolted right on straight. There's nothing else. And the problem is, if you hit a rock at speed, at hull speed, you're gonna push that keel up into the hull of the boat. And if it's a cord hull, like most boats now, you're gonna destroy the boat. I've seen also somebody broke their mooring ball and they ended up on the beach. And the waves weren't even that bad, but they were just pushing them farther and farther on the beach. There needs to be boats that come by and they pull you off the beach, and the whole weight of that boat is now sitting on that fulcrum. And what happens is the fulcrum bends back and forth and it starts leaking, and it does damage and it destroys stuff. And then the keel has to come off, which means the mast has to come off, because you can't take a keel off a boat without taking the mast off the boat. And it's just a huge amount of work. So better have a boat that can withstand a grounding or a hit of a rock or an accidental beaching. Okay, I'm sitting here editing this, and there's one thing I didn't really explain well here, and I think it's really, really important, so just bear with me. It's gonna just be 30 seconds. So the way that fiberglass works is that it's very, very thin pieces of glass, like strings of glass all woven together. And the reason it's so strong is because of the weight distribution. It's like a blanket. So when you push on it, if it's got resin in it, it's pushing against all those fibers and it's distributing the weight on the whole length of the cloth. So imagine you've got 5 friends, right? You have got a bowling ball and your 4 friends are all holding the corner of a blanket, right? Now, imagine there's 10 blankets. They're all holding 10 blankets. And you put the bowling ball in the middle. It's very strong. It'll hold that bowling ball no problem. Now I want you to cut a bowling ball size hole in the center of all 10 blankets. All right? So you put the bowling ball on, it falls through. How would you fix that? You'd probably take each blanket off and put another blanket on it. So now what if they were all glued together? You can't access it every one. So what you have to do is you have to grind out on a much bigger hole that has an angle to it that goes all the way down to the first layer of glass, and then basically put in layer upon bigger layer upon bigger layer upon bigger layer to try and basically sew these blankets back together by gluing in pieces of blanket that are the size, and that's called a scarf. And that's really the only way to fix fiberglass well. That's how the fiberglass is fixed. So if you have a keel and the bolts start elongating the holes through that hull, and then you try to go back and fix that, especially if you have a boat with a liner in it, so that some boats have a hull and another liner like a Beneteau, it is impossible to fix that as well as it was before originally. It'll never be 100%. You can fix it well, and you can fix it so it doesn't leak anymore, but I mean, I wouldn't want that boat. Okay, back to the video. All right, this is our last underwater chapter, rudders. So, what's better? 1 rudder, 2 rudders, 10 rudders? I'm telling you, I was never a fan of the dual rudder thing. I've always been kind of a Puritan sailor where I wanted a skeg protecting the rudder. But after that delivery on the boat that pounded, the crazy one that my girlfriend said was the Habitación of Terror, that was a Bavaria 60 with dual rudders. And oh my gosh, it was so stable at speed. It was amazing when going fast downwind. But unfortunately, that was the only time it was really amazing, because when we got into port, it was horrible in the marinas. We ended up banging into another boat because we had lost the bow thruster due to water ingression, and that thing would not maneuver without those thrusters because of something called prop wash. This is how prop wash works. When you are going forward on the propeller, you're pushing water backwards, right? That's what's happening. So when it's going over the rudder, if you turn the rudder, you can actually push water over the rudder and move the back end of the boat either closer to the dock or farther away from the dock, or you can drive that way. That's how you drive a sailboat. Well, that doesn't work on a 2-rudder boat because all of that prop wash is just going right out the back and not even hitting the rudders. So it makes maneuvering in tight quarters in marinas very difficult. A lot of manufacturing companies are switching to dual rudders. Oyster's doing it, Amel's doing it, Fiberglass's doing it. There are a few that are not. Kraken actually has a skeg that's made of a big piece of aluminum and then glassed over. It's really cool, and I really like the way they do that. And he's got a story where he takes the boat out for its maiden voyage, and it's some crazy like 30,000 mile voyage, and they hit something hard enough at hull speed to stop the boat. And they thought they had bent the rudder shaft at least, but nothing happened. It was just a chip out of the skeg. You can see that story in a link in the description of the video. So, what did we learn today, kids? Nothing, Mr. Evans said it was all your opinions and stories. Yes, but there's a method to the madness, and if you just bear with me for 2 more minutes, I'll explain it. If you don't remember anything else from this talk, remember this. Everything about sailboats is a compromise. The biggest thing we talked about was how widening sterns are affecting upwind performance. Now, I could have just told you that. These kinds of boats get worse upwind performance, but you wouldn't have understood why. And that's why I went into it. We also talked about how vacuum bagging is making sailboat hulls stiffer, lighter, and cheaper, but it comes at the cost of being not so strong with any kind of penetration. And these types of hulls are subject to damage that other types of hulls maybe would withstand. We learned a trick to compare 2 boats on your short list by superimposing the images and looking at the forefoot and looking at the underwater profile to see how they'll sail offshore. We talked about different transom shapes, the overhanging transom, the canoe stern, or the typical swim platform transom that you find on a lot of boats. Then we talked about keels. There are literally hundreds of different keel shapes, all kinds of wings and crazy stuff that happens under the water. But the big takeaways here are the encapsulated keel has no chance of falling off and will withstand damage a little bit better than the bolt-on keels, but you'll sacrifice upwind performance with those longer keels. Lastly, we talked about different types of rudders, the single rudder without a skeg, single with a skeg, and dual rudder setups, and some pitfalls with that. Those are pretty self-explanatory, really. In part 2 of this video series, we're going to get out of the water and start looking at the top side of the boat and talk about a few things that will make or break your cruising experience. If you'd like to get more information on any of these subjects we've covered, please look in the description of the video because I've put a ton of links down there for most of this stuff. Anything relatable, I thought that might help you guys. If you'd like to come back to this later, please save this video. There's a little save tab right under the video. You can do that. And if you learned anything or this was entertaining, please hit that like button and subscribe to see more videos just like this one in the future. Much love, and see you next time.